We're going to continue our discussion of effective instructional strategies by talking about grouping. So we have a variety of ways in which we provide instruction to children, and all of them, as far as grouping, are effective. We need to use the right grouping situation for the right lesson for the right student or students. So as you can see in the bottom picture, you have whole group instruction where you have the teacher working with the entire class. There's also, it looks like, an instructional assistant there who's helping with the children, or it could be a resource teacher. So, and this can be done on the carpet like this teacher is doing. It can be done at desks. It can be done at tables. But whole group, obviously, is when the entire class is included in the group and in the instruction. Also, we have students who will work in small groups. Small group sizes will be determined again by the lesson and the objectives. So what is going to be the most effective? Is it going to be a smaller group of pairs? Maybe it's 2 students to a group. Maybe it's 3 students to a group, or 4 students like it is here. It might be where the class is split in half, so it might be larger groups. But not the whole class. And then, of course, there is a need for individualized instruction one-on-one, and it could be for reteaching. It could be for having challenges for students who need that additional challenge, who need the extensions. So we can use individualization or one-on-one teaching for a whole host of different reasons. It could also be to build the relationship with this student. It could be for behavior management or child guidance. So we want to look at all of these groups as effective instructional strategies and make sure that we're using the right grouping situation for the lesson that we're teaching. And to some extent, that will be determined by our objectives and the standards that we are using for our lesson. Now, the next slide on the PowerPoint is a turn and talk. Of course, we're not going to do that because this is an online lecture, but take a minute, stop, and think about what are the advantages and disadvantages of each of these groups. And when would you use a whole group for instruction, a small group for instruction, or one-on-one teaching? So stop. You can pause the video and think about when you would use these different grouping contexts within a lesson. And on that note, we're going to talk about context or location. Where are we going to have our lesson? Are we going to have our lesson inside the classroom, outside? I think we tend to do almost all of our instruction, the large majority of our instruction, inside, and that is appropriate. But there are many times that we can go outside and use the outside, the natural environment, as a great context for our lesson. So start to think outside the box a little bit and think about when going outside might be an appropriate context for your lesson. And it doesn't have to be just during science time. Think about it during social studies when you're talking about communities and neighborhoods, and when you're talking about the school as part of the community. What about for reading? Can you go outside and have a literacy or a language arts instruction lesson outside, and when would that be an appropriate context? And then, as we saw in the grouping picture, you can have students on the carpet, you can have students at their desks, you can have them at small round tables, you can have them at the kidney-shaped tables, particularly if you're doing guided reading groups. So where within your classroom is the most appropriate context for specific lessons or specific components of lessons, whether it be the direct instruction piece, whether it be the activation of prior knowledge, direct instruction, guided practice, independent practice. You could move in your lessons, you'll be moving around the classroom. So for each component of the lesson plan, what is the appropriate context or location? Also, don't forget about the computer lab, math lab, science lab, different reading lab, different areas, the art room, different areas around the school that might be a better match for the objectives and standards of your lesson. So you can go outside the classroom. In many schools, you can book the computer lab or book the math lab or science lab at various times throughout the day. There's usually a sign-up sheet. It could be a Google Doc, but just check out your school and see what other resources are available to you to use as a context or location for your lesson. So that's one thing to think about, again, when you're thinking about your lessons. Child-initiated instruction. This is always important. We want to, if we're following developmentally appropriate practices, we're certainly thinking about choice and offering students choice. And that is where child-initiated instruction comes into play. So when are we offering opportunities for children to guide their own learning? Is it just during the independent practice phase of a lesson, or could it be during the direct instruction phase as well, where the students are directing their own learning? Also, we'll talk later about guided inquiry and what are we doing for the different phases of guided inquiry as an effective instructional strategy for lesson planning, and how are we infusing or integrating child-initiated instruction into guided inquiry, which is a natural home for child-initiated instruction. At the bottom, the picture, because it looks like it's a fisheye lens, that is actually a makerspace. And we're starting to see makerspaces in almost all of our schools, whether it's in the library or the science lab or somewhere in the school, there is a makerspace. And it can look very different from one context to the other. But makerspace is an ideal spot for children to use child-initiated instruction, where they have choice, they build their own learning. So where within your lesson planning and looking at effective instructional strategies can you infuse as much as possible this child-initiated instruction? Not only does it allow for choice and it's developmentally appropriate, but it also teaches children to become their own learners, responsible for their own instruction. It also builds on their curiosity, it builds their confidence, and it sets them up to be lifelong learners. So there are a lot of really long-term side benefits to encouraging child-initiated instruction. And from child-initiated instruction, we can move on to teacher-initiated instruction. There is certainly a time for a teacher to provide direct instruction and for a teacher to be a facilitator for instruction. And that can happen again in the guided inquiry process. The teacher can provide direct instruction in some of the phases of guided inquiry, but the teacher may also serve as facilitator, whether in guided inquiry or other lessons. That is where children really take control of their own learning and the teacher helps to facilitate. Go back and reread or do some research into Montessori and Reggio Emilia. Those are where you will see facilitation of teachers facilitating learning rather than and really supporting child-initiated instruction. But there are appropriate times for teachers to provide direct instruction and guidance to students. And again, these are just some examples. You want to have a balance and you want to make sure that your classroom is not all teacher-initiated instruction. We tend to see that when we go into classrooms. We tend to do that when we have our own classrooms. But see if you can find a balance where there is more opportunities for child-initiated instruction to balance out all of the teacher-initiated instruction. We also have the need for individualization. We need accommodations. Accommodations are what are you doing for the student? Something that happens to the student, whether it's a pencil grip or it is supported seating or it's an AT device. That is an accommodation. A modification is done to curriculum. So modifications could be, instead of students working on 10 problems, this individualized program for a student, they work on 5 problems because that's enough for that student. So modification is something you do to the curriculum. Instead of reading a full chapter, you read certain pages within the chapter. So accommodations and modifications, whether or not a child has an IEP, accommodations and modifications can be appropriate for students in the classroom. How do you build upon the likes, differences, and preferences of your students? That's also individualizing your instruction. So maybe when you're doing a math activity, when you get to the independent practice, maybe there's a group of students that are working on math problems that have to do with basketball because they're really interested in basketball. So maybe they're looking at basketball scores. Or maybe there's students that are really interested in football, so they're looking at football scores, excuse me. Or maybe there are students who are interested in dance, and so there's some type of math that involves dance. But how can we build these activities and practice opportunities for students that addresses their likes, differences, and preferences, and also their strengths and areas of need? There are going to be students that are going to excel in certain areas. It may be math, but then they don't excel in reading. Or it could be in math, they excel in number concepts and in computation, but they might struggle in geometry, or they might struggle in word problems because they're struggling in reading. So we need to make sure that we have a very good handle on what our students' strengths are, what are their areas of need, so that we can design our lesson plans and our instruction around the individual needs of our students. So this doesn't mean that you have to meet with students individually in every single lesson. You might, but if you're providing accommodations and modifications, then you are individualizing so that your students are successful. So the last couple of areas we want to quickly discuss is extension. What can you do to extend your lesson for those learners who need a different challenge? And it's not always more. Instead of doing 10 problems, do 20 problems. Usually for those kiddos who learn the concepts quickly or already know the concepts, what can you do to challenge them with higher order thinking skills? Go back to Bloom's taxonomy, and what can you do to have students create something? Can their product be different? If you know that they know these computational skills, what can you have them do that challenges them in a different way? Where they're already mastered the objectives of the lesson, what can you do to extend it for them? And on the other hand, there are students who need reteaching. How are you going to go back and revisit that lesson, those lesson objectives, and reteach that concept or those concepts to the students who need the information taught in a different way? So, for example, let's take math. This is the easiest one to discuss quickly is math. So you have an hour block for math, and you might do your engagement, your activating prior knowledge, and then you might do your direct instruction. And that direct instruction might take 15 minutes or possibly 20 minutes of direct instruction. You might do that in a whole group. And then after that whole group instruction, then the students break into small groups to do their independent practice. You may have done a guided practice as part of your direct instruction. And then when you're getting ready to do the independent practice and you break into groups, you might take, as a teacher, you might take a group of students who need some reteaching and work through their independent practice more as a guided practice or reteaching to ensure that they are mastering those skills. So you can use your grouping as an effective instructional strategy to meet the needs of the students who need the extensions and to meet the needs of the students who might need some reteaching. So that is going back to this concept of knowing the areas of need and strengths of your students so you know whether to provide an extension or reteaching. And again, based on the different lessons and the content, it's going to change. The same students are not always going to need reteaching. The same students are not always going to need extension. It's going to change based on the content and based on the students.